Hello, everyone. Today we'll start talking about meditation 5. So we'll be skipping meditation 4. The path out of skepticism, the skeptical worry that Descartes has, goes through God. I think therefore I am necessarily implies that I exist, that my thoughts exist, that I have immediate access to my experience and my thoughts. How does one escape that? How does one know anything about other than one's own existence and the content of one's own mind? It is through God. It is through proving that God exists and that God created humans for the sake of them doing well, or at least partly for the basis of doing well. And that becomes the guarantee, the assurance that the sensory faculties are reliable, at least to the extent that we can get about in the world, in that there's a rough match, a good enough match between our senses and the real world. So let's talk about God, proving that God exists. So, quote, clearly the idea of God, that is the idea of a supremely perfect being, is one I discover within me. The first datum for Descartes' argument is that if you think about your mind, the contents of your mind, you will find this peculiar idea, the idea of a being that has all perfections to the maximal possible degree, all perfections that can come together in a being to the extent that they can come together to the maximum degree. That is the idea of God. And what he means here is something like, for something to count as God, it must have these things. My idea of God includes all those things. For something to be God is to be the being that has all perfections. That's capital G, right? Like, so Zeus, Poseidon, other minor gods do not have this. Capital G God is the supremely perfect being. And that's an idea that Descartes finds within himself. And he thinks every thinker finds this idea within themselves, or at least can cook up the idea, can think of the idea by thinking of perfection and the way in which perfections come together. So the idea of God as a supremely perfect being is a very natural idea, accessible to any mind, even within the skeptical worries about the evil demon, that there's deception going on, all of our experiences not being accurate representations of reality. When I think of it, Descartes continues, with more attention, I clearly see that the existence of God can no more be separated from the essence of God than can its having three angles equal to two right angles be separated from the essence of a triangle, or the idea of a mountain from a valley. So here's what Descartes is noting. If you think about the nature of the ideas, what the ideas represent, so your idea of a triangle becomes the means whereby you grasp the nature of triangles, what it is to be a triangle. Your idea of a human becomes the means whereby you grasp the nature of humanity. Your idea of a mountain becomes the means whereby your mind grasps the nature of being a mountain. And Descartes notices that those natures, which are the kind of parts of the ideas, the things that we grasp through the ideas, have necessary implications for the kinds of things that can count as instances of those ideas. So the mountain, for example, Descartes thinks that essential to what it is to be a mountain, to the idea of a mountain, is that it is this kind of leap of earth with trees and things like that, but this leap of earth that is kind of contrasted with a valley area, flat area. Nothing would be a mountain that it is contrasted with a valley that kind of marks the beginnings of the mountain. It wouldn't be a mountain if it's not that. It would be something else. So to be a mountain is to be the kind of collection of dirt in a particular way that is contrasted with the valley area. Or the essence of a triangle is the thing that entails all of the theorems and facts, mathematical facts about triangles. And you cannot separate those. You cannot think of a triangle without thinking about, for example, the Pythagorean theorem or something like that. If you're thinking of something that looks like a geometrical shaped triangle, but it does not obey the Pythagorean theorem, you're not thinking of a triangle. You're thinking about something else. The essence of a triangle, and the right kind of triangle, is the one that entails that theorem and all of the mathematical theorems that apply to that triangle. In your mind, when you're using your reason adequately, you cannot separate those things. And he thinks that God's essence is being a supremely perfect being. That is what his essence is, what God's essence is. Thomas Aquinas, for example, would say that God is the supremely perfect being, that all perfections are included within God or kind of constitute God in some way. But Thomas Aquinas will shy away from claiming that that is God's essence. Thomas Aquinas insists he does not know what God's essence is. By the time we get to Descartes, Descartes is a lot more confident in his reason. He's a rationalist. He's not an empiricist like Aquinas. Descartes thinks that he knows the essence of God as supremely perfect being. It actually does not matter whether or not we think of, it doesn't matter for the purpose of the argument, for the adequacy of the argument, that we think of God as, that we think that God's essence is to be a supremely perfect being. We just have to think that being a supremely perfect being is a condition necessary for something to count as God. As long as we think that, and that's more like along the Anselmian lines of thinking, that's all we need for the argument to get off the ground. But to read Descartes carefully and adequately, we must include that for Descartes, that is the essence of God. We grasp the essence of God by grasping that God is the supremely perfect being. This does not mean that we fully exhaust all of the perfections that are within the divine essence. We don't understand all the perfections. We don't do that. Our mind is not capable of that. But our mind is capable of knowing that the essence of God is to be the supremely perfect being, the being that has all perfections to a greatest possible degree. And I think that's transparent to our intellect if we think about it. And here's the argument. It's a very short argument. It's a cool argument. It's a version of the ontological argument, like Anselm's. Quote, thus, it is no less contradictory to think of God, that is a supremely perfect being, lacking existence, that is lacking some perfection, than it is to think of a mountain without a valley. If you think about a mountain, you think necessarily of a thing that is contrasted with a valley. That's what you have to think of if you think of a mountain. If you think of something that is a pile of dirt, that there is no valley next to it to define it as a mountain, you're not thinking of a mountain, you're thinking of something else. For you to be thinking of a mountain, you must think of something that is contrasted with a valley. And likewise for mathematical entities and so on. Here's the basic point. God is the being that has all perfections. Existence is a perfection, therefore God is the being that has the perfection of existence. It is contradictory to think of God as not having the perfection of existence, precisely because the being that you're thinking of as supremely perfect being having the perfections, will lack a perfection, namely existence. So this really smells like Anselm, but in a much more straightforward sense. So let's actually put that formally, carefully. And this is Anselm's argument, or a version of Anselm's argument, but very straightforwardly, very kind of direct. Premise number one, God has all perfections. Premise number two, existence is a perfection. Premise number three, or conclusion, first conclusion, God has the perfection of existence. And that really is the conclusion, but I'm going to formulate it differently. Therefore, God exists. So four I just take to be a different way of saying three. And this is it. This is the argument. This is the very straightforward argument. And they're really just two assumptions. Remember the rules of the philosophy game. If you think the conclusion is false, you can point to it not following from the premises in case if it doesn't, or if it does follow, if it's a valid argument, the only rational way of responding to it is to deny one of the premise reasonably justifiably, with having good reasons for thinking that one of the premises is false. Those are the only reasonable, rational responses to an argument. But this is very succinct, and they're really just two premises, right? There's not a lot to debate. Let's look at one again. God has all perfections. You might worry that something illegitimate is happening here, what is called begging the question. That's a philosophical term for meaning assuming what you're trying to prove. And if one is assuming what it's trying to prove, then this is a very, very bad argument. So if one is to be read as God exists and has all perfections, if that's how you're reading one as a question begging claim. In other words, if that's what one is supposed to be saying, then this is not a good argument at all. It just presupposes what it's trying to prove. But Descartes doesn't have to, and in fact, does not read premise one this way. What Descartes means when he says God has all perfections is something like a condition for something to count as God is for that thing to have all perfections. And that claim does not require that there is a thing that is God, that exists, for it to be intelligible. So think of, let me give a couple of other examples of what premise one is supposed to be saying. So think of the exception, I'm sorry, the claim, unicorns have one horn. Unicorns are horse-like entities with one horn, either of those sentences. Those are true sentences. It is true that unicorns have one horn. It is true that unicorns are horse-like entities with one horn. Now, it's also true that there are no unicorns. No unicorns exist. So that does not undermine the truth of unicorns are, to be a unicorn is to be a horse-like entity with a horn. That's still a true sentence. Why? Because that sentence is not saying there are unicorns, they exist, and furthermore, they have one horn. Right? That's not what the sentence is saying. If that's what you think the sentence is saying, you're misunderstanding the sentence. Here's another instance of the kind of thing one is doing. Think of the President of the United States. So here's a sentence. The President of the United States is the head of the executive branch of government. That's a true sentence. Notice that that sentence is true even if there is no president. Suppose the president of the United States were to die, there'll be this gap in between deciding who's going to become president. So there'll be this period of time in which there will be no actual human being that is playing the role of president of the United States, right? There's this gap a couple of days whenever the official transitions happen. During that gap in which there is no actual human being that is the president of the United States, it would still be true to say that the president of the United States is the head of the executive branch of government, because that sentence, much like unicorns have one horns, are not saying there is one person, one being that exists in the real world, and it has this thing, this property. That's not what the sentences are doing. The sentences, unicorns have one horn, the president of the United States is the executive head of the branch of government, the head of the executive branch of government. Those sentences articulate conditions for what it is to be a particular kind of thing. To be the president is to have the property or the characteristics of being the head of the executive branch of government. Any being, anything that is not the head of the executive branch of government is not the president. Those things are true even if there are no actual existing presidents. Likewise, unicorns. If there is this thing that has no one horn, it's not a unicorn. And all of that is true even though there are no unicorns. That's what one is saying. Something like that is what one is saying. God has all perfections. That is, if God existed, he has all the perfections. But it's not just the condition. It's not if God, then. That's one way of getting it. But another way of trying to get at what one is saying is to say that what it is to be God is to have all perfections. Something does not count as God unless it has all perfections. So it's really just kind of a description of the right definition of the word God. There is no thing that is denoted by the word God unless it fulfills all of these conditions. It has all perfections. Like there is no thing that is denoted by the expression the president of the United States unless it has this condition, being the head of the executive branch of government. All of those are true sentences. None of them require that there is actually a thing that has those properties. And that matters a lot in this context, right? The sentence one cannot and should not require or should not require that God exists for it to be true. If that's the case, then the argument is question begging. It does not prove what it's trying to prove. But the good news for Descartes is that we can and should, and he does intend to read this sentence in a way that does not require that God exists for it to be true. And that's exactly what Descartes wants, right? A sentence that is true, that we can all agree on, that is transparent to the intellect, that you can clearly and distinctly perceive that the most perfect being is the being that has all perfections. That sentence is true whether or not there exists a thing that is the supreme perfect being. So it's really just spelling out the definition of what it is to be the supremely perfect being. That is one. And that is true regardless of whether or not God exists. That's one. So one is not controversial once you understand what it says. All of the action is unto. Existence is a perfection. To exist is to be better off than not to exist. Think of a painting. Think of the Mona Lisa. Before the Mona Lisa was painted, It had all sorts of perfections, beauty, color contrast, whatever, artistic perfections give rise to a beautiful painting like the Mona Lisa. But it lacked a crucial perfection. It wasn't real. It was just a thought in Da Vinci's mind. When it was painted, it acquired a new perfection. It existed, right? It was actually part of the real world. And that made it better. To exist is better than not to exist. That's premise 2. It's a fundamental claim about value, fundamental claim about goodness, fundamental claim about perfection. It is more valuable to exist than not. But that's it. Like, that's all the argument needs. It follows that if existence is a perfection and God has all perfections, it follows that God has the existence of perfection because he has all of them, and therefore God exists. Very straightforward argument, hard to argue with. Here's an objection, though. Here's an objection that Descartes himself considers. Objection, quote, "From the fact that I think of God as existing, it does not follow that God exists, for my thought imposes no necessity unto things." This is Thomas Aquinas' objection to the ontological argument. Thomas Aquinas insists that the argument only establishes that my concept of God includes the predicate of existence, but that's perfectly compatible with God not existing. So here's again Aquinas' objection that Descartes considers, though does not ascribe it to Aquinas. That I must think a specific way does not show that reality must be this way. My thought imposes no necessity unto things. And the objection continues. And just as one may imagine a winged horse, Pegasus, without there being a horse that has wings, in the same way, perhaps I can attach existence to God, the predicate of existence to the concept of God, even though no God exists. So again, this objection is stating that at best what follows from this argument is something about human thinking capacities. Humans, when they think of this about this concept God, must include the predicate existence into the idea of God. But this does not show or entail that God exists precisely because human thought imposes its no necessity unto things. That we must think a particular way does not entail that reality is that way. So again, someone like Aquinas is moved by this objection. Here's what Descartes would say in reply. Aquinas, you're misunderstanding the argument. Look at the argument again. Remember, the rules of the game are to engage with the argument, not to say something else. Premise 1 is not about my concept of God. Here's a different argument. My concept of God includes all predicates of perfection. Existence of perfection, therefore my concept of God includes the predicate of existence. And of course, from that claim, it does not follow that God exists. You're right, Aquinas, that's a bad argument. However, that is not this argument. Premise 1 is not about my concept, it's not about my idea, it's about God. Just like the claim Pegasus are, or unicorns are horse-like entities with a horn, it's not a claim about my idea of Pegasus, it's a claim about unicorns. It's a claim about unicorns, the nature of unicorns, what it is to be a unicorn. I'm using my ideas to think of the nature of unicorns, to think about the nature of unicorns, to talk truths about the nature of unicorns. But I'm not talking about my ideas. That's a different claim. I mean, I can talk about my ideas too, but that's not what I'm doing in this argument. This argument, it's not about my idea of God. It's about God, whether or not God exists, right? So it is just a misreading of the argument. Here's something else that Descartes says in reply, though. Here's the same objection again. The ontological argument does not work because thought imposes no necessity unto things. Here's what Descartes says in reply. Sure, you're right. Not that the argument doesn't work, but that thought imposes no necessity unto things. Of course it doesn't. That I think something does not make reality be that way. That's pretty weird. Of course not. Maybe God thinking something makes reality be a particular way, but not my thought, not human thought. But it is not my thought that imposes necessity unto things. That's not the argument. It is the nature of things which does this. It is the nature of God which imposes necessities having to do with God. It is the nature of Pegasus that entails necessities of Pegasus. It is the nature of unicorns that entails about what is to be a unicorn. It is the nature of being a president that entails things of being the president. It is the nature of things which I think about through my ideas. That's what is imposing the necessity onto things. My thought merely recognizes or grasps or understands or clearly and distinctly perceives, as Descartes likes to put it, these necessary relations. My thought is not bringing them about. My thought is just recognizing them. I'm just seeing them there. I'm just understanding them there. And that's perfectly valid, right? That's how we do math, for example. Not that my thought brings this about or imposes any necessity on anything. Of course it doesn't, right? Like, that's not the argument. You object or are misunderstanding the argument. But rather the necessity of the thing itself, the nature of the thing we're thinking, unicorns, precedents, God. Namely, the existence of God forces me to do so, to think so. It is the necessity of things as understood by my intellect that forces me to think that they must be that way. That's the right order of explanation. I grasp the nature of God. I grasp the nature of unicorns. I grasp the nature of being a president. And I see that some things necessarily follow. And because those things necessarily follow, then I must think so because I'm thinking about them in the right way. So again, the same is true of geometry. My thoughts of what makes triangles be triangles does not make them be triangles, but rather my thoughts follow the conception or grasping of the nature of triangles. If I understand a triangle in the right way, I see that something like the Pythagorean theorem follows from it. And I must think that way because I'm grasping the natures of triangles in the right way and I'm seeing what follows. Not that my thought is imposing any necessity. Of course it's not. My thought is merely grasping the necessity that is there. That's exactly what's happening with ontological argument. My thought of the nature of God as the supremely perfect being entails that, the nature of God entails that God exists, therefore God exists. Like my thought of the nature of triangles entails that Pythagorean theorem. Therefore, the Pythagorean theorem is applicable to some triangles, to the triangles whose nature I'm grasping. So it is reason that is discovering truths about natures that are necessary. It is not imposing anything. And Descartes thinks this argument goes through despite the threat of the evil demon, despite the threat of skeptical worry, because we're not talking about how my experience of anything matches or fails to match corresponding reality. That's where the gap is in the evil demon. We're just talking about necessary connections between ideas, and that's all within the mind. And then the corresponding truths of those necessary connections between ideas. So those are not experiences that are threatened by the evil demon. So the ontological argument goes through, works, claims Descartes, despite the threat of the evil demon. I can prove that God exists, even though the evil demon's threat is in the background. Okay, let's end here. I will see you next time. Bye.